Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the C.G. Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event, I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
This would be the start of a very, very interesting topic, which is synchronicity and astrology through the lens of Jung. Did not came up with these concepts, but pretty much wrote a lot about them and thought a lot about them. And a little bit of background knowledge to Jung himself, famous Swiss psychologist, lived from 1875 till 1961 and had a very long life, very productive life, wrote an incredible amount of books and about a very, very wide array of topics. So for those who look into the group and for those who looked into the podcast, see that there are very, very different topics that Jung talks about, but he connects them all pretty well through the psyche and his investigations and his concepts. And something was pretty special about Jung because he was there at the beginning of psychology when it all started as a science, beginning of the 20th century, and especially psychoanalysis, which was started by Freud. And when Jung was very young, he was a little bit like a mythbuster. So he would look at different phenomena and would find an explanation for it, which was often the unconscious. So he wrote his PhD thesis, for example, about a cousin of his who was a medium. So she would talk in foreign tongues with different personalities. This was a huge craze at that time to have seances with mediums that then would change their characters and have strange knowledge and so on. So he would write his PhD thesis about her and taking part at the seances and really watching what was happening and recording and trying to find commonalities with other mediums. And he basically came to the conclusion that she was not really aware of doing something, but that does not mean that she was not part of it. He pretty much said that the person as a medium would be split in a conscious part and an unconscious part. And the unconscious part would do things, and the conscious part would just not recognize that the person would be doing it. It's a little bit when you are thinking about something and your facial expression changes. Other people can see what you think and what your mood is and so on. It happens automatically. It's unconscious. You don't know what your face looks like unless you have a mirror around or people tell you what you're looking like. And this, in a more extreme form, he saw in the mediums, especially when things are moving. He realized that it was a person moving the table or objects, but the person did not realize that it would do these movements. So it looked like things were moving by their own. And he would look at different phenomena and see this unconscious part. And this was very often the explanation for him. Okay, something was happening, but people were just not conscious of it. Same, he visited a friend in his summer house, and suddenly he would have visions of a dead person next to him in the dark. So they had a feeling that there was some specter, that the house was haunted. And he talked to the owner, and he said, many guests have this feeling in this room, but only in this room in the house where he was staying, Jung. And through investigation from the previous owner of the house, he found out that somebody has died in this room. So this would be a little bit spiritual, like, the ghost of the person is still in the room. But Jung's suspicion was rather that there was still some blood or some matter of the person still there, and that his nose would pick up on this. So the unconscious would register these very low signal information, which could not reach consciousness. And what the person would encounter would not really be a ghost or a specter, but rather their unconscious experience of something. So it's really that in the psyche, there are different alleys of perception. And the conscious perception needs very loud noises, but the unconscious can deal with lower noises. But the unconscious talks to the consciousness, and this way these visions come. Because it's correct, somebody died there, so he had a vision of a dead woman. So the connection is there. And this is Jung in his, let's say, mythbuster phase, where he takes things, looks at them and says, okay, there's a psychological explanation for it. And he was a psychologist, trained psychologist, worked as a psychotherapist, and was really involved in that. But as longer he's been living and the more he investigated, the more he realized, okay, there is actually something more going on than just this explanation of, it's the unconscious, and people are not realizing that they're experiencing or that they're doing something, that the things are happening around them, but they're just not aware of. So he looked at all those different things. So psychology, of course, but he looked also at alchemy, astrology, synchronicity, and these effects and events to find why are people interested in them and what is the psychological value. Because for him, everything that humans did and were interested in were a sign that this is how the psyche functions. It's something profound. It's the same when you have things that are popular, like songs or movies or books or anything else. It has to speak to something inside a lot of human beings, and this must signify something about human experience and how we are structured inside, because it's difficult to look into the psyche, because the psyche is looking at itself and tries to interpret itself. So it's prone to all the different biases that are possibly available. So one topic he really looked into was synchronicity. And synchronicity, I had a hard time to understand it. He had a very good example that I found later in a letter that he wrote to someone, because there's a linking connection between causality and synchronicity. And causality is just this influence this, and this influence this influence this. So there's this logical chain of events, and one thing happens after the other in a temporal order. And his example would be when you would go to the beach and standing there looking at a river or the sea or whatever, and a hat would be lying there without much else. The causality way of looking at it would be, okay, why is this hat here? How did it come here? And his example would go that, okay, there's a boat on the river and there are people on there. Likely the wind came, blown off the hat from the person, and it's now here on the beach. And this explains why the hat is here. But a synchronistic approach would be looking at it. It's not really this, okay, why is something here and what happened before, but rather, what is the meaning of all those different things happening at this exact point in time? This is not only, okay, why is this hat here, but what does it mean that this hat is here, that I am here, that it's this time of the day, that there's a couple in the bushes that are kissing, that there's a rotten tree next to me, that there are birds flying over. So the exact moment with all its components, what does it signify that all these things come together at this specific point in time? And a lot of foretelling techniques like the I Ching or Tarot work this way. For those who don't know, the I Ching is basically a couple of sticks. It's an old Chinese technique. And you have a huge bundle of them, of the sticks, and you put them like this on the table and you just let go. And then they fall in all different directions and create a certain pattern. And then there's this huge book called the I Ching. And you would look up, okay, the pattern that the sticks formed, what does it signify? And this would be synchronistic in that the sticks are corresponding to this point in time and signify something about this point of time and telling something about other things that are causally not related, but rather happening at the same time. You can pick up this stick and let it fall, and it's every time different because the point in time changes. And tarot works also this way, that you, for example, you shuffle the cards, and when a card falls out, then you have to take this card. Or that you lay the cards, or there are different techniques to do it. But again, this idea of, okay, I have a question for the cards. So I draw the cards, I look at the cards, and these are telling something again about this specific point in time. And I can't really replicate this point in time. It's like a river. You can't step in the same river twice. There's a proverb about this, because the river has already moved on. Same with time. So you can't put out the sticks and 5 times after the other, the same pattern will be, or we will have 5 times the same set of cards. Because through your knowledge and through the changes of time, of course, this has then to be different in a synchronistic view. And this connection between causality and synchronicity fits into Jung's pattern of shadow, which means that shadow are the things that are not illuminated. This means when you concentrate on one thing, you have to ignore a lot of other things that are happening at the same time. His idea was that reality and the universe and everything that's happening is so complex, and humans are very, very limited, that they have to focus on very specific points to experience something. We can only experience a part and have to ignore everything of the rest. And that would be shadow, the shadow parts. And basically, you have to look around in all directions to get a complete view, but you can't have the complete view in just one picture. And the same way as causality describes this logical progression of things, synchronicity is not going through time, but rather orthogonal to it. By taking this slice of time and saying these things are not causally related, but they are temporal related in this specific point in time. And he says, okay, this causality idea and thinking is a very Western thing. And it's so old and so natural, especially in the Western world, that we don't really think about other ways. But he described it in the East, China, for example, that this synchronistic view is much more common, especially with Tao, this concept of Tao, to say, okay, what does it mean that all these things are now happening at the same time? So synchronicity, something which is so specific that it very likely only happens at one time, which makes it difficult to prove, right? Because when you look at science, it is very causality-wise. So when you want to prove something scientifically, you need to be able to repeat it and look at it statistically to find the pattern. You have to be able to replicate it. This is something very important. When you have a discovery, people will try to replicate it to see whether it's true or not. But when you have something that is so specific that it can only happen one time, it's not really scientific. And that makes it difficult to see these synchronistic events and map them. And he came up with this idea and investigated it when he was a professor in Basel. So after he studied Jung, he taught as a professor in Basel, and he met, of course, other professors who were there. And one of them was Albert Einstein. And they sat down, Jung wrote in a letter and talked about their different fields of expertise. And this was before Einstein talked about relativity publicly, but he was already investigating this relative behavior of time and space. And he was trying to explain it to Jung. And Jung was completely dumbfounded because it's physics, and it's very complicated physics. And Jung came a little bit at ease when it was his turn to explain his field of expertise, because Einstein had very big problems with psychology. But Jung said this was already a germ in the back of his mind, that there's something that is not really static about space and especially time, and that there's more things going on than we normally think about in a causal way. Because what was before Einstein and these physicists was this very Newtonian worldview of causality and causal events. And there was a point in time where the idea was there that physics is completely explored, and there's almost some problems that only have to be fixed and then and investigated, and then everything can be explained. And then becomes this whole point with relativity and quantum physics and so on, which makes everything way more complicated. So it was pretty much around this time. And Jung always worked on this problem over his life of relative time and space and synchronicity. And in his later life, he met Wolfgang Pauli, the famous physics Nobel Prize winner, who was a patient of his, which was a secret for a very long time, but became then public. And there's a very good book about the dreams of Pauli called Dream Symbols of the Individuation Process, which I can highly recommend. It's a great seminar about individuation and dreams. And they formulated more this idea about synchronicity and what it could mean, and investigated it. So Jung's whole life was about this. And his idea is really centered around this idea of time, that the unconscious and the psyche has a very strong idea about time and the passing of time. He had this example of you can make yourself wake up at specific times, even when there's no clock around to wake you up, so that there's something inside the psyche which is always ticking and bringing in certain changes, seemingly all by itself. and he had this idea of archetypal influence. So, okay, I have to first talk a little bit of archetypes. When you have the psyche, you have a consciousness, you have first your personal unconsciousness. So this is really this shadow part, the things that you don't attend to about your own psyche. But even lower than that is a collective unconscious, which is basically human nature. This is the part that makes us similar to all the other human beings that are around. And even deeper than that, that makes us similar to certain animals and so on. And you go lower, lower, lower until you hit chemical components of the body. And of course, then in the end, physics. And the collective unconscious for Jung consisted of archetypes, which are a little bit like mini dramas that are happening, that have beginning, a middle, and an end. This means certain patterns of behavior that just come up all by themselves. You can see this very strongly in animals, as animals know how to breed and find a partner and go south when it's getting too cold. Nobody has to teach them. It's an instinct that is already in there, that is their nature to do. And these archetypes have influence over the life of people, because human beings do the same things. We look for partners, we have certain goals, we have certain things to do, and we have also different stages in life where we have different requirements and different wishes what to do. So he saw this component of time really in the collective unconscious and with the archetypes. As the archetypes are removed from time as eternal, it's already a precursor for evolutionary biology, that certain things that happened so often in the past that they become part of the psyche of humans or other animals. And this, he hints at that, explains a little bit why certain events can happen at the same time, even though when they are not causally related. And that's by having an archetypal underpinning and the archetype acting up at different places, different psyche at the same time. And it's a little bit similar to clocks. So when you have one clock and you start having other clocks just connected to that, think about you have a clock and you split it up now in two clocks and they have the same time, or to split it up, split it up, split it up. It would seem like all the clocks have the same time because there's some connection between them, but they're just started at the same time. And this is the reason why they show the same time. So there's this connection of different parts which are seemingly unrelated because the collective unconscious is coming from below. So there's not really a direct connection between things happening at the same time, but rather through a very roundabout way to an incredibly long past, these things are related. Sorry if that sounds a little bit confusing, but it will become clear with some examples. So what Jung proposed, to be more aware of these synchronistic events and to be a little bit more convinced of them, is to look at coincidences, things that are seemingly unrelated, but then again related somehow. There's a movie about Jung and his friendship with Freud, and it's with Viggo Mortensen, Michael Fassbender, and Keira Knightley. It's called A Dangerous Method. It's a good movie, and it's based on a play which is again based on the biography of Jung. And there he very often says he does not believe in coincidences, and does it so often that it sounds a little bit like a catchphrase. He does not say it like this in his written words, but it's actually this idea of there's not really coincidences, there's just a connection you don't really see. And I had personally this experience, which was rather synchronistic, and I want to tell it to you just to give you an example. One day I was reading a book in the morning, and it was from Fry. I forgot the first name, but it's about the retelling of the Greek hero myths. And it's very good. It's very humorous. Stephen Fry, I think, the British comedian. And in the book, in this chapter that I read, he talked about the Titan Atlas who held the sky on his shoulders. And there I learned that basically the Atlas Mountains are North Africa, which I did not know. It never occurred to me that this is the same thing. And later that day, I went to work and I had to look at some candidates that wanted to fill a role in the company. And I was supposed to screen them whether they are suitable for an interview. And one of them wrote down that he had experience and of course has some hobbies. And he wrote down that he was a paragliding instructor who spent half a year in North Africa in the Atlas Mountains. And I always thought, okay, that's a little bit weird. I just learned today that the Atlas Mountains are in North Africa. Now I have some guy who spent half a year there. And so I worked the whole day. And after work, I went drinking with some work colleagues. And we basically went around the city a little bit drunk, and we went into some places I've never been before. So I have no idea where I am. Everything is dark. And I go around this corner, and right in front of us is this restaurant. And in very bright yellow letters, it's saying Atlas. And saying, oh, okay, yeah, this is super weird. And it's this kind of coincidences where Jung says, okay, there's something happening, that certain thoughts are popping up, certain things are happening around, and this is just nothing of this is causally related, but for some reason it's happening in a very confined time frame. So this is synchronicity, and it will be important for, especially with this concept of time, for the next topic of the evening, which is astrology. And for astrology, I have to apologize because I don't have so much knowledge about astrology itself. So I'm very happy to have some people here who can help out on that after the presentation. Basically, all my knowledge is rudimentary and the view that Jung had on astrology. So I apologize already at the beginning, but it's no problem to explain the concepts and to understand the concepts, even if you don't have so much knowledge about astrology. So very shortly, astrology is around the stars and the planets and how they relate to each other. And the relation of them to each other can say something about things that are happening now or that could be happening in the future. And it's these 12 signs corresponding roughly to a month in the year. And as the Earth rotates around the sun, I'm so hoping that I'm getting this right, we are a different sign in astrological horoscope. At the same time, you have this idea of, okay, when you are born in a certain month, you have certain characteristics, or it's saying something about your fate. So you can have a horoscope every day, every month, every year that will say something about your future, the things you have to look out for, things are positive, things are negative, and also how people can fit together based on their horoscope when they were born. For example, I'm born in January, late January, which means I'm Aquarius, a waterman and Wasserman. And this is the short introduction to astrology in general, with one very interesting information. And this I didn't know, and Jung wrote about it, that there is, for a very, very long time, there were only 11 signs and not 12. And the 12th part, which is the last part, is scales. And scales actually cut off pierces from Scorpio. So, and the interesting part is it's the last thing. It's the only thing that it's not an animal or a person. So it's already moving away from this animal person part to more cultural part, civilization part, because astrology as an endeavor happened not with primitive tribes people living in the forest. They were not really interested in the stars so much, but rather as soon as you had civilization, you had people looking at the stars and finding, of course, certain connections. It was really this Sunday tracking of time, changing of months, changing of seasons, and how people became aware of the regularity, for example, of the flood in Egypt, which was very important for the Nile River to fertilize the lands, was just by documenting of all those lights up there in the sky and finding afterwards the patterns. So there was first the documentation and then the realization, oh, there's something in the data, a little bit like data mining, that helped them then to predict certain things like the Nile. So you have certain events that could be predicted by astrology because changing of time, such as the Nile, other things. In earlier times was interesting to tribal people was rather the moon, because the moon is a very big clock in the sky. It has a regularity and you can see how it's changing. So very often primitive societies were more interested in the moon. The more it got civilized, it was more this look into the sun, but also the look into the stars and the tracking of time through stars. And this started in Mesopotamia for the Western format of astrology. In all cultures all over the world, you have different kinds of astrology. And the one I'm talking about is this Western kind, the 12 signs, which started in Mesopotamia, is still used till today. And here, of course, Jung as a mythbuster comes in and says, okay, astrology as this science is not really accurate anymore. Because when we say, okay, we're looking at the stars and see their positions and how they behave, the rotation axis of the Earth has changed in the last 4,000 years because it's always changing slightly, which of course shifts the star signs in the sky, which means everything is shifted. So the astrology that we are looking at today is rather how the sky looked like 4,000 years ago. So he said, okay, yeah, if there's a connection, it can't be what it actually is in the moment, but rather what it was 4,000 years ago. He noted that every time when he talked about astrology, that people would write to him and say, like, okay, why do you try to make it so complicated? It's vibrations from the stars and the planets, and they're influencing the things here. And he said rather, he doesn't think it's vibrations, but there has to be something else that's going on here. And all in all, he said, astrology itself is not really reliable in the sense that you cannot use it like a clock, or you can use it very scientifically. For that, it's too unreliable. But he found something that made it for him interesting again. So it's always this mythbuster mode of, okay, I'm trying to test the concept and see, okay, it's not the obvious answers. And then he has this way of going deeper into it to find an alternative explanation. And this alternative explanation for him is rather that the sky was a kind of screen where people projected their psyche on, which means what is the sky and the planets and the stars really? It's really blinking lights. So you don't have the points and say, okay, this is now a Scorpio and those are twins and so on. It's human beings that label these phenomena and who give names to it and pictures and so on. So for him, the act of projection is that you are not really seeing the world, but rather your psyche, but you're unaware of it, which means you might have the feeling that something objective is happening, but it's rather subjective. So he believed that the people in the past looked into the sky and saw, okay, here we have certain figures, certain animals, certain objects, and we see them clearly and things happening. And we have the planets, and the planets are called Jupiter and Venus and so on. And there's no coincidence that these are the gods, as the gods are powerful and they're almighty, and they're also way up high. But in the end, Jupiter does not really have a name. We've given Jupiter a name. We did not ask Jupiter, okay, what's your name? But rather people said, oh, this is Jupiter. And this is a projected part that people have things of the psyche and it's outside and they document it. And this gives insight into how the psyche works and what's happening inside in the psyche. So he saw astrology really as the first form of psychology, as people interacting with their psyche. They were thinking they're interacting with the outside world in an objective manner, and even a scientific manner, an investigative manner, by collecting data, by interpreting, by trying to predict, and so on. But rather what they documented was the things happening in their psyche. And he would find these symbols and labels that would be corresponding for him to certain psychological phenomena. For example, that the sun has a meaning and the moon has a meaning, which is the moon being female and unconscious for him, representative of the unconscious, as it would come out in the night when it's dark and people could not see correctly and all weird things would be happening. The sun being the warm, shining thing being associated rather with consciousness, and that these things take turns and play different roles. And the interesting thing is this idea of lunacy and lunatics comes from luna, which is Latin for moon. So he saw this as a psychological happening, this investigation of astrology, but there's more to it. And he admitted to that. there has to be something to this astrological endeavor, especially in context of personality. Because what Jung did very often in his practice, when he could not find clearly the personality of the person, because he said when you have a neurosis, you're not really sure if you're interacting with a person or complex psychological trouble they have inside, which makes it difficult to see, okay, what is the real person? He would get a horoscope. He would get a very specific horoscope for the person to have just a starting point to find, okay, start digging, where is the real person? And he said there is something to it when people are born at certain points in the year, that this has an influence on their personality and in that way also on their life. But he said it can't be really connected to the signs, because the signs are the signs from 4,000 years ago. So he said there's rather a component of time which is happening in the unconscious and that's influencing this, that the procedure is correct of these signs, but rather it's not really connected to the stars and the planets how they were 4,000 years ago. It was just a coincidence that the stars and the moon and the planets were like this 4,000 years ago. But this is still valid, even though that the extraterrestrial bodies are not in the same positions anymore. But this is happening in the psyche, because the psyche was projected onto this 4,000 years ago. And he said it's even more specific than a month. So it's not only a month that indicates what the personality of a person can be, but rather the day, the hour, the minute has an influence. When you have people born at the same day, at the same time, that they are like grapes on the same vine, that there are similarities to them. And also that when you are born at a certain time, that you're rather attracted to certain persons with a different personality, also corresponding to the horoscope. So, and this goes back to this idea of when you have a person and the person is living, it's one-sided in its consciousness and in the way that consciousness was formed. Again, this idea you're concentrating on a certain part of reality and experience and preferring this, ignoring the other stuff, but the other stuff is still there and has to be taken care of. And what people are doing as they're living, and the psyche tries to realize itself and individuate, become a whole, complete being, not only a limited conscious part, but a complete being with all the experiences. People are looking outside in the world for the things that they are lacking inside, which means you are attracted to a certain kind of person based off the things that you are missing. Here saw especially men and women being attracted to each other because they are both representing the unconscious shadow part of their respective psyche. So what Jung did later in his life, and he tried to get a mathematician to do this, he would get a lot of horoscopes for his patients and their partners also that they have married. And he gave this data to a mathematician and said, okay, please tell me if there's a statistic significant distribution to what kind of people go together. So I now will have a back example and I will be wrong, but let's say Aquarius is fitting very well with Gemini. So he wanted really to know, okay, these people which are born at a specific month, specific day, specific hour, specific minute, and the personality, if it was more likely that these people would get married and go into relationship. And he could not do the math for this because he was lacking the statistical skills. And he tried to get a mathematician to do it. Mathematician would not do it. It's many letters back and forth because the mathematician was fighting the premise. And Jung was like, yeah, I know this sounds strange. And I don't say that it's causal, but I think there's a certain accumulation regarding these constellations of personalities and birth dates and birth hours that they're more likely to come together. Sadly, then it dropped off because the mathematician didn't want to continue. But it was this idea of Jung saying, okay, there is something there, but it's not necessarily astrology, but rather this idea of time that is happening in the background. So what you have then over the year is fulfill all the different configurations of personalities you can be born with through these 365 days and 24 hours and so on. So all the configurations are born at different times and then find their respective partners. And there's all these different ways of looking at the world and experiencing the world. And by exchanging between each others, humans can then get a more complete picture of what is happening because everybody is limited in their own way. And by exchanging between, all these limited ways, you can get a more complete view and you can experience this complete view. And it goes further. And this is now the special topic for the evening, which is ions. And some of you might have heard it because it's a book that gets very highly recommended regarding Jung. And it's a very hard book to understand. He wrote it very late in life. It's 76. And it took him 10 years to write. So very complicated book. Except for the very first chapter, which is great introduction to Jungian psychology because he lays all the groundwork. And when you read it, read the first chapter and say, oh, this is amazing. This is a great summary how the psyche is structured. I have the ego, I have the shadow, I have anima animus, I have the self, and so on. Bring it on. I'm very interested in what the rest of the book will be. And the rest of the book is how Jesus is like a fish. That's a very big part. And then it goes into alchemy, and you're very confused. What is he trying to get at? Why is this so weird? There is this idea with ions that there's a huge undercurrent in the collective unconscious. So the part which is of human psyche and which is connecting every human being and even animals. And it's that this collective unconscious is not really static. It's not only always the same thing, but rather like a person which is born, is then a child, is in puberty, is an adult, and then an old person at a certain point dies. That this change of life is not happening only on an individual level, but also on a collective level and the collective unconscious. So, of course, a human being, you're born, you're a baby, your personality is constantly changing because your psychological needs are changing constantly. So it's very different if you are 5 or 15 or 25 or 55. It's a change. There's other demands that are demanded from the person, the individual, how to conduct the life. And this idea of the development of the collective unconscious was proposed by Jung, and it's separated in ions, and it's corresponding to these 12 signs of the horoscope. Because the Earth is moving not only around the sun, but the sun is also moving. So we're changing where the position of the Earth is constantly, and we're changing it very slowly. And it's this idea of having these being, I don't know what to call it, into this astral place that you have this Aion Pisces of the fishes, which went from roughly the year 0 until the year 2000. And earlier of Aries and earlier of that Gemini, and then of Aquarius, this idea of the new age of Aquarius that has recently started, that this has an influence on the psychology of humanity. And this undercurrent is like these wave motions that are in the background, and humanity with their psyche is on top of these waves and moving with it, and is pushed into certain directions, and certain ideas come up at certain times because it's in this lifetime of the collective unconscious to bring up these ideas. And this is why he's talking in Aion about Jesus as a fish, because one of the most significant things that happened 2000 years ago was the birth of Jesus Christ, which is the reason why we have this calendar now, starting with the birth of Jesus Christ. And it was exactly this point in time where there was a huge upheaval in humanity as the Roman Empire faded and gave way to something else. The story is pretty weird, as Christianity came up fairly newly. Nietzsche saw it as one reason, as a reaction to having massive slaves in Rome. At one point, the population of Rome was 90% slaves. So a strange thing to think about when you say, okay, the Romans persecuted the Christians, but roughly 200 years later, Christianity became the main religion of the Roman Empire. It's a little bit, if you remember it from Star Wars, the very first Star Wars movie, there's the old wise man, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he's fighting against the big bad guy, which is Darth Vader. And at a certain point, Obi-Wan Kenobi does not fight anymore, and he said, like, when you kill me, I will get stronger. But anticipate, of course, Darth Vader kills him. And it would be like that 200 years then later, everybody would be a Jedi, and the Empire would say, okay, yeah, everybody's a Jedi. So this complete switch from, okay, we're persecuting all the Christians to the point where like, hey, we are actually Christians. This huge turn of mental mind shifting Jung saw as this change of ions from Aries, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly, Pisces, which is the fishes, which is why the idea of Jesus Christ and the pictures that are very associated on many, many levels in the Christian church with the fish and Jesus, that this connection comes from the collective unconscious, from this ionic view of changing science, and that this influences humanity and how it brings out culture. So you have this very extreme shift suddenly because the Roman Empire declines rapidly. Their religion fails, their state fails, everything fails. And out of it, Christianity is born. And Christianity is suddenly the dominant force for 2000 years. And you saw like this is only possible when there's this Christian element active in the psyche of all people in the Western world, of course. And he sees this upheaval as pushing from the collective unconscious, as this is a point where all creative and cultural work is coming from, and dreams and symbols and so on. And it's all very fish-centered, extremely fish-centered. This is the coincidence, which is then kind of weird again and synchronistic, to have it at this point of time happening. And he's saying like, these changes of ions means a complete change of the undercurrent in the psyche. And this is why there's huge upheaval, huge changes in a very short time, and revolution in blood. Like, Christianity really tore apart a lot of pieces of the Roman Empire. That's why the Romans did not like it, because suddenly families were torn apart because young people all wanted to be Christians. And they went out into the deserts, and the cemeteries was overwhelmed. Everybody wanted to be poor, which was not the Roman style. The Roman style was really, you want to be extremely successful. You want to go to war, and through war, you get all your riches and you get fame. And all the Romans, they had rooms in their houses, which was the ancestor wall. And there were busts of all the ancestors going back generations. And all the kids would be pushed there by their parents and saying, this is your great-great-great-grandfather, he did that. And this is your great-grandfather, and he did that, and so on. And you also have to do something. Extremely achievement-oriented culture. And then in contrast, you have the Christians who say, okay, yeah, we're pacifists. We don't want earthly things, and so on. So it's this complete change of mind, which influences, of course, the Western world till today. And this is really this idea of an ion, that you have a collective spirit that is suddenly coming up, and which is characterizing a huge point in time. And he sees that right now again. He lived through the First and Second World War, Jung, that this point of time is again with this change into Aquarius, which will necessitate a different kind of thinking, a different mode of being. He said it's in Roman times and before, there were already a lot of technology and knowledge that we have today, but it was not utilized. For example, the Romans, they could not sail against the wind. The Normans came up with that over 1.5, 2,000 years later. They really had to wait till the wind is coming from the correct direction if they wanted to go somewhere. Also, there's this steam machine that the Greeks came up with. They already knew it. You may have water vapor and you can use it to have a mechanized motion, but it was a toy. There was never this step going further into the steam engine and mechanizing things. So he said, like, there's a certain limit that is not surpassed because the unconscious pushing is not happening. And the special thing about Pisces, the ion we were in for the last 2,000 years, is that it's separated in two parts. And there's the upright fish and the laying down fish. And the first one is Jesus, and the second one is the Antichrist, the evil sibling, so Lucifer. And it is this progression in the last 2,000 years that you have the rise of Christianity, but then, of course, you have the falling down of Christianity. And this happened roughly 1,000 years ago, he said. And this is especially characterized 500 years ago with Martin Luther and the Protestant movement, which of course fractured the church. And now we have this very materialistic view again into the world. Christianity, very spiritual, but now we're rather materialistic again. And this, of course, then will change with Aquarius according to Jung. So these changes, incredibly slow, does not happen in a lifetime, happens over many lifetimes, hundreds, thousands of years but there is something happening in the background, and there is something constantly pushing, because something was also pushing human beings into civilization, into culture, and so on. And he really saw that as something acting in the background through time and through synchronistic events. And this, according to astrology, which are the animal signs that we have in the sky, at least what we saw there. So pretty much later in his life, he came to this conclusion: there has to be a psychic layer in reality that is underlying and influencing a lot of things, that are transgressing space and time and has an influence. And he saw this through his investigations into synchronicity, astrology, and this concept of ions. And so you have to start with a young mythbuster Jung, who dispensed of a lot of things because he said, it's the unconscious, it's the unconscious. And then he looked into the unconscious through his lifetime and saw like, oh, there's way more than one would think there is. And this would be the end of my presentation and the end of the topics with the surprise topic of ions. And I hope you found it entertaining, and I hope you were able to follow through some pretty tough concepts. This is very advanced Jung, I can tell you. But these three things together, they're fitting very, very nicely. That's why I wanted to put them together in one event. And I want to thank you to bear with me and listen to all of that, because it's rather heavy.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG Jung Helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.